The first thing he remembered when he tried later to piece the night together was the smell. Wet fur, warm and heavy, layered over something deeper underneath. Damp earth, animal sweat, a faint sourness like an old hide left too long in the rain. This is the encounter a hiker claims to have had with a Bigfoot, and it is one of the strangest ones I've heard in a while.
It was the smell of a living thing pressed close enough that he could feel its breath on his face, and the smell of a living thing that was not human. He would tell his wife weeks later that he had spent his entire life camping in the woods of Washington and had never once encountered an odor like it. Not bear, not elk, not goat, something else. The second thing he remembered was the grip. He was being held the way a father carries a sleeping child. One arm beneath his shoulders, one arm beneath the backs of his knees, his head resting against something warm and solid that rose and fell with the rhythm of heavy breathing. He could feel the weight of his broken legs hanging out over open air. He could feel the rough texture of fur against his cheek, and he could feel with the strange detached clarity that sometimes comes to people who have stopped expecting to live, that whoever, whatever was carrying him was being careful. The third thing he remembered was the motion. A steady, loping stride down terrain, so steep he could hear loose rocks skittering away behind them, faster than he could have moved on this slope with two good legs. Faster than any person could have moved while carrying a 180-pound man. The branches of subalpine fir slapped against the creature's shoulders and chest. He felt them brush his arm, his face. The sound of running water rose somewhere below them and then fell away. He did not understand where they were. He did not understand how they had gotten there. He opened his eyes once, just once, for what he later guessed was less than a second, because his nervous system would not let him keep them open. He saw the underside of a jaw, dark fur, the cord of a throat, the faint blue line of a vein running down the side of a neck that was not human. He saw the curve of a chin that no animal he had ever encountered possessed, and he closed his eyes again because his brain refused to accept what it had registered, and because somewhere in the back of his mind he understood, even half-conscious, that staring was not the appropriate response, that whatever was carrying him down this mountain was permitting him to be carried. 40 minutes earlier, he had finished saying goodbye to his wife in his head. Not out loud, he hadn't had the energy. In his head, because he was certain, in the careful, sober way, that men who know the wilderness know things, that he was about to die alone on a scree slope above a glacial drainage in the North Cascades. And he wanted the last thing he thought about to be her face. He was wrong about the dying part. He still doesn't understand the rest.
That man is real. He won't sit in front of a camera, he won't let me use his real name, and he asked me 3 separate times during our conversation whether his location was going to end up in a video. So please do understand why the secrecy.
I'm going to call him David because he asked me to use a name that isn't his. The actual one is on a release agreement in a drawer in my office, along with the signed terms of how I'm allowed to tell this story. He works in a profession where being publicly associated with what you are about to hear would end his career, and possibly his marriage, and definitely his standing in a community he has built carefully over 20 years. He is not a Bigfoot believer. He has never read a Sasquatch book. He has, by his own account, gone his entire adult life without giving the subject 10 consecutive seconds of serious thought, and he resents, politely, but resents that he now has to. We were introduced through a mutual contact in late 2023. He had been looking quietly for someone who covered this kind of material with what he described as a willingness to be skeptical. He had ruled out 3 other channels and 2 writers before he agreed to talk to me. Our first conversation lasted 4 hours. Our second, 8 months later, lasted 3. He answered every question I asked the same way both times. Here is what I can verify. He was hospitalized in late September of that year in a regional medical center in Northwest Washington with a broken tibia, a shattered ankle, a scalp laceration that took 14 stitches, severe dehydration, and mild hypothermia. The injuries are documented. The hospital admission is on record. The county sheriff's office logged a recovery that day from a Forest Service road on the western flank of the Glacier Peak Wilderness. brought in by a logging truck driver who had been hunting grouse on his day off. Here is what I cannot verify. The 4 hours between the moment he went over the edge of a scree slope above a glacial drainage at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, and the moment a logging truck driver pulled over to investigate what looked like a man lying in the grass beside an empty forest road. He has no photographs, he has no recording, he has, in the official record, no creature account at all, because he told the EMTs that day that he had crawled, and he has never officially said anything else. The only place he has ever said anything else is to his wife, and, after a great deal of consideration, to me. To understand what happened to David in the late afternoon of that Tuesday, you have to understand who he was on the Sunday morning before. He was a competent, experienced solo backpacker. He had been hiking that range, off and on, since he was 19. He had done a version of this route twice before, once in his late 20s and once in his mid-30s. And he had built his trip plan the way careful hikers build trip plans. Written itinerary, left with his wife, designated check-in dates, satellite messenger clipped to his pack, 3 days of food beyond his estimated finish. What he did not have was a hiking partner. He was, by his own admission, the kind of man who preferred the woods alone, and he had spent enough years in them solo that he had stopped registering it as a risk. He had a daughter starting her sophomore year at a state university 4 hours away. He had a wife who teaches middle school. He had a job that consumed 11 months of his year, and the 12th for him was always this: a week somewhere in the Cascades, by himself, walking until his head was quiet again. The trip started clean. Sunday afternoon at the trailhead, Sunday evening at his first camp beside a creek he had camped at twice before. Monday, a long day of 10 miles and 2,400 vertical feet up onto an alpine bench. Monday night at the second camp under a sky so clear he could see the Milky Way through the door of his tent. He took 2 photographs that night. He sent one of them to his wife from the InReach the next morning. It is the last photograph of him from that trip that exists. Tuesday morning, he broke camp early. The plan was a long traverse along a high ridge, dropping back into timber by mid-afternoon, with the goal of making a 4th camp beside a tarn he remembered from his trip in his 30s. He estimated 8 miles. He was carrying just under 30 pounds. The weather was holding. There was no warning of what was coming. One detail before we move on, and this is the kind of detail that does not seem important until you are looking back at the whole sequence later. The second night, the night under the Milky Way, David told me he heard what he assumed at the time was an elk somewhere on the slope above his camp. A single long deep call that rose and then trailed off. He has hunted elk in the eastern Cascades for over a decade. He knows what an elk sounds like, and he told me in our second conversation that he had thought about that sound a great deal since, and that no elk he has ever heard makes that particular call in late September at that elevation. He let it pass at the time. He went back to sleep. By morning, he had forgotten about it. He did not forget about it again. I want to pause David's account here for a few minutes and give you the broader context, because the North Cascades are one of the more under-discussed Bigfoot regions in the country, and what happened to him sits inside a record that goes back longer than most people realize. The Upper Skagit, the Sauk-Suiattle, and the Nooksack peoples have lived in this country for thousands of years, and their oral traditions describe a forest being that predates by centuries the term Bigfoot. The names vary. The descriptions are remarkably consistent: tall, dark-furred, bipedal, intelligent in ways that distinguish it from any animal, capable of moving silently through terrain where humans cannot. Treated in those traditions not as a monster but as a being to be respected and avoided, with its own territory and its own rules. The modern sighting record in the same range is substantial. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization carries dozens of Class A and Class B reports across the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest and the Glacier Peak Wilderness, the most recent updated within the last several years. There are ranger and Forest Service accounts going back to the 1950s, Packer reports out of the high country in the 60s, a 1969 incident near Marble Mount that ran in the local press, and a steady drip of solo witness reports, hunters, climbers, fishermen that has never really stopped. I personally think the North Cascades are one of the most overlooked Bigfoot ranges in the country, and I want to be clear about why I think that. When the Pacific Northwest conversation comes up, it defaults to the Olympic Peninsula and the Oregon Cascades, and there is good reason for both. But this stretch of Washington between the Skagit River and the Stevens Pass corridor is so vertical, so unbroken, so genuinely roadless, that a population of something the size of a Sasquatch could live a complete life cycle there without ever crossing a maintained trail. The terrain is the size of a small European country. The trails are a handful of dotted lines across the middle of it. There is a thread that runs through these regional accounts that I want to flag now, because it is going to matter when we get back to David. The witnesses are not, by and large, Bigfoot people. They are people who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time, depending on how you look at it, and who are almost universally annoyed that the experience happened to them at all. They are not selling books, they are not running channels. Many of them, like David, will not let their names be used. The thing they all have in common is that they had to figure out, after the fact, what to do with an experience that did not fit anywhere in their lives before it occurred.
One thing that has always struck me about the North Cascade reports, almost none of them are people who came here looking for Bigfoot. They are climbers, packers, fishermen, hunters, and occasional Forest Service employee who would lose their job for talking. And every time I read one of these accounts, the witness sounds annoyed that it happened to them. That is the part I find the hardest to fake. Nobody fabricates a story, they actively wish it hadn't happened.
Tuesday, 2:15 in the afternoon. David is roughly 4 miles into his planned traverse. He is moving along a steep slope above a glacial drainage that drops away to his right, gaining ground by traversing diagonally upward across a band of loose scree and small talus. He has done this kind of terrain hundreds of times. He is not being careless. He is moving with the deliberate, repetitive efficiency of a man who has been on slopes like this for 30 years. He is taking a high line. The trail proper drops down into timber here, around the head of the drainage, and adds about a mile to the route. He has cut this corner before. He has cut this exact corner before, in fact, in his 30s, on this same trip in reverse, and he remembers it as straightforward. What he does not register until afterward is that this corner was straightforward in July of the year he was 36. It is now late September. The slope is the same. The conditions are not. There is a thin crust of overnight ice in places where shaded rocks have refrozen. And there is a quality to the scree that he later realized was different, drier, looser, the surface broken up by an unusually warm summer of freeze-thaw cycles. He takes a step. A fist-sized rock under his right boot rotates outward, dislodging the smaller rocks beneath it. His weight shifts to his left foot. The 30-pound pack on his back, which has been comfortable all morning, becomes a lever. He feels himself going over before he has time to do anything about it. The fall lasts somewhere between 3 and 5 seconds. David's memory of it is fragmentary in the way that real survivors describe falls, a series of disconnected images, a sky tilted 90 degrees, the sound of his own pack frame scraping against rock, a flash of something white, which he later realized was a patch of unmelted snow in the shade beneath a boulder he had not seen from above. A heavy impact that knocked the wind out of him. Another, a final landing. He lands in the bottom of a narrow side drainage 40 feet below where he had been standing. His right tibia is broken approximately 8 inches below the knee. His left ankle is shattered. There is blood running into his eye from a scalp wound he cannot yet feel. His pack, which had ripped open during the fall, is somewhere on the slope above him, and the InReach satellite messenger that he was carrying in the top pocket is either with the pack, buried in the rocks of the drainage, or somewhere in between. He will spend the next 20 minutes trying to figure out where it is. He will not find it. The first emotion he registers is not pain. It is a kind of cold, analytic clarity. He understands almost immediately what has happened, what his injuries are, and what they mean. He understands that he cannot walk. He understands that he is somewhere between half a mile and a mile and a half, off the line that any searcher would walk if a search were called. He understands that no search is going to be called for at least 4 days because he is not officially overdue until Saturday. He understands that the temperature is going to drop into the low 30s or upper 20s tonight at this elevation. And he understands finally what all of that adds up to. The pain arrives about 10 minutes later. By then, he has already stopped pretending he is going to live. He spent the afternoon making peace with it. He told me about that period of time more carefully than he told me about almost any other part of the experience, because he wanted me to understand that it was not a panic. He had been in the mountains long enough and had read enough accounts of people who had not made it home to know what was happening and what was about to happen. He did the practical things first. He took stock of what he had on his body, which was a small water bottle on a hip belt, a half-eaten energy bar in a chest pocket, a windbreaker he had stripped off during the ascent and tied around his waist, and a wool cap. He did not have his pack. He did not have his sleeping bag. He did not have his stove or his shelter or his food. He did not have his inReach. He did not have any way of signaling. He did the geographic things next. He looked up the slope he had fallen down, and he understood he could not climb it. He looked at the drainage running away below him, and he understood he could not walk along it. He looked at the sky and he watched the sun, and he understood that he had perhaps 4 hours of daylight left, and that after the daylight he had perhaps another 4 hours of survivable cold, and that after that he would begin to lose function, and that after that the process of dying would simply continue without his participation. And then he did the personal things. He thought in some detail about his wife. He thought about his daughter, who was in her first weeks of her sophomore year, and about the conversation she would have to have with her mother about him. He thought about the things he had said to his wife the last time he had seen her on Saturday morning, before he had loaded the truck, and he found that he was satisfied with them. He thought about a few specific things he wanted to apologize for, and he apologized for them out loud to nobody on a scree slope in a drainage that did not have a name on any map he had ever looked at. He did not pray. He told me that very clearly in our second conversation. He did not pray because he is not a man who prays, and he did not want to be the kind of man who only prays at the end. He simply lay back against the cold rock and watched the shadows climb the opposite slope and waited. He was, in his own assessment, perhaps 40 minutes from the boundary between hypothermia and unconsciousness when he first heard something coming down the slope above him. His first thought was bear. He told me that immediately, and he repeated it in our second conversation. His first thought was bear, and his first emotion was not fear, but a kind of weary acceptance. A black bear scavenging on a wounded man in the deep wilderness is a relatively fast end. He had read enough wilderness accident reports to know that. He had thought in the quiet hour preceding that it might happen, and he had decided that if it did, he would not fight it. There was nothing to fight with. The footsteps got closer, and almost immediately he realized they were not bear. Bears in steep terrain make a specific kind of noise. Four-footed, irregular, the sound of claws on rock. What he was hearing was bipedal, two-legged, heavy, deliberate steps, with the soft scuffle of something coming down loose scree without slipping. The footsteps stopped at the top of the slope. David could not turn his head far enough to see directly upslope, but he could see in his peripheral vision the shape of something standing at the edge of the drop he had fallen down. It was backlit by the afternoon sun. He could not make out its features. He could see very clearly that it was tall enough and broad enough that no part of him was prepared to call it a person. It stood there for what he later estimated, with the careful imprecision of a man trying not to overstate, was approximately 2 minutes. It did not move. He did not move. There was no sound except his own breathing and the wind in the firs on the opposite slope. Then it came down. David told me that this was the moment that broke his understanding of the world in a way he has not been able to repair. The figure did not climb down the ski slope. It did not pick its way carefully or use its hands for balance or do any of the things a human being would have to do on that terrain. It descended on two legs, upright, with the steady, controlled stride of something that had walked down slopes like this its entire life. 40 feet of loose, unstable rock. No skidding, no slipping, no falling. It reached the bottom of the drainage and walked toward him, slowly, without sound. And it crouched on its heels, about 6 feet from where he was lying. His description of what he saw in those first close moments has not changed between our first conversation and our second. The creature was at least 7.5 feet tall standing, taller crouched than he was sitting. Its fur was a dark reddish brown, with patches of gray across the chest and along the underside of the jaw. Its face was, in his words, and these are exactly the words he used both times, more sad than scary, a heavy brow, deep-set, dark eyes that he could not bring himself to make contact with, a flat, slightly broad nose, a mouth that was closed. It looked at his legs, it looked at his face, and then, without warning of any kind, it slid one arm beneath his shoulders, the other beneath the backs of his knees, and it lifted him into the air as if he weighed nothing at all. What followed was the period that the cold open of this video described. I do not want to repeat the same details, you have already heard the sensory layer, but I want to fill in what David told me about the carry itself. The things he was able to register in the moments when he was conscious. The first thing is direction. The creature did not retrace David's route. It did not climb back up the slope he had fallen down, and it did not follow the drainage downhill in the direction water would have flowed. It moved across and slightly down, on a diagonal that David could not reconstruct on a map afterward because he was unconscious for too much of it to be sure of the landmarks. What he can tell you is that they crossed at least one ridge that he had no memory of being near, and that they passed through stretches of timber that he had never been in before in his life. The second thing is rhythm. The creature did not pause. It did not set him down to rest. It did not shift its grip to reposition him. The carry, from the moment of being lifted to the moment of being laid down, was one continuous motion at a steady, loping pace that he estimated with the imprecision of someone who was unable to time it. Somewhere between 5 and 7 miles an hour over terrain on which a fit man with 2 good legs would have struggled to make 2. The third thing is breathing. He was close enough to the creature's chest to hear it breathing the entire time, and what struck him, what he kept coming back to, both conversations, was how quiet it was. Something that size, moving that fast, carrying that much weight, should have been audibly working. It was not. It was breathing through its nose, slowly, evenly, with the controlled efficiency of an animal that was nowhere near the edge of its capacity. The fourth thing is care. This was the detail David came back to most often. The creature did not handle him roughly. When branches threatened to scrape his face, he felt the chest beneath his cheek shift slightly to angle his head away. When the carry passed through a stretch of dense vine maple, he felt the creature use its forearm to push the worst of the brush aside before continuing through. Whatever instinct was driving this, whether some learned behavior, some inherited template, or something he doesn't have a word for, was not the instinct of an animal moving a piece of meat. He estimates the carry lasted approximately 1 hour. It could have been less. He believes it was more. And then, somewhere on a slope he did not recognize, in a section of timber he had never seen before, the creature slowed. It walked a few more steps, ducked beneath a hanging branch, and emerged onto a narrow gravel Forest Service road. That, by every map he was able to consult later, should not have existed within a day's hike of where he had fallen. It crouched down very carefully and laid him in the grass beside the road. It stood up. It looked at him for a moment that David said felt much longer than it could have been. And then it turned and walked back into the timber on the uphill side of the road. And within 4 or 5 steps, he could no longer hear it moving. 20 minutes later, a man who works for a small logging operation in that part of the county pulled around the bend in his pickup truck on his way back from a Sunday hunt for grouse and saw what he thought was a body lying in the long grass.
The part of this account that sits with me is not the size, the smell, or any of the things you would expect. It is that the creature knew where the road was. David did not know, and he had been walking that range for 30 years. And whatever carried him took him on a direct line to the place he had never seen before and stopped exactly where another human would find him within an hour. That is not luck. I do not know what to call it, but that is not luck.
I want to spend a few minutes on what is verifiable in this account, because the channel's standard is that I tell you what I can and cannot stand behind. And on this story, the answer is detailed. The medical record is verifiable. David was admitted to a regional hospital in Northwest Washington on the evening of the day in question. The admitting injuries are documented: a closed spiral fracture of the right tibia, a comminuted fracture of the left ankle, a 14-stitch scalp laceration, dehydration consistent with several hours of exposure, and a body core temperature of 94.8 degrees Fahrenheit at intake. The medical chart describes a recovered backpacker found by a private citizen on a Forest Service road, with injuries consistent with a fall on technical terrain. The recovery location is verifiable. The county sheriff's office maintains an incident log for that day showing a citizen-reported recovery of a specific spur of a specific Forest Service road in the western reaches of the Glacier Peak Wilderness. I have not put the road number in this video, at David's request, and I will not. The geography is the part that is hardest to explain away. David's vehicle was located by his wife approximately 48 hours later at a trailhead on the east side of the same wilderness. The distance in a straight line on a map between his vehicle and his recovery location is just over 11 miles. The actual walking distance over the only terrain a person could plausibly cover on foot is closer to 13, and it crosses one significant ridge above 6,000 feet that David, on broken legs, could not have crossed under any conceivable circumstance. The truck driver's statement to the responding deputy is on file. He described pulling around a bend, seeing a man in the grass, stopping, and finding him semi-conscious and incoherent. He told the deputy he had seen no other person on the road that day in either direction. And he made one observation that did not make it into the formal incident report, but that he repeated to me through the same mutual contact who introduced me to David 3 years after the fact. He said that the patch of grass beside the road where David was lying, the grass on the uphill side just inside the timber, was matted down in a rough circle, like something heavy had stood there. He said he had not mentioned it at the time because it didn't seem important. He has thought about it since. I want to make space here for the most serious counter-argument to David's account, because I think it deserves a fair hearing, and because if you take this channel's voice seriously, you should expect it. In the literature of extreme survival, there is a well-documented psychological phenomenon known as the third man factor. It refers to the experience reported by an extraordinary range of survivors of life-threatening situations, of a sensed, unseen presence, often described as a companion, sometimes as a guide, occasionally as a rescuer that accompanies the survivor through the worst hours of their ordeal and disappears once they are safe. The phenomenon is not fringe. Ernest Shackleton wrote about it after his crossing of South Georgia in 1916, describing a fourth man walking with his party of 3 across the glaciers. T.S. Eliot wove the experience into the third section of the wasteland. Frank Smythe reported a companion accompanying him near the summit of Everest in 1933. Joe Simpson, in his book Touching the Void, described a guiding voice that talked him down off the Ciula Grande in the Peruvian Andes after his climbing partner had cut the rope. The Canadian writer John Geiger collected over 100 such accounts in his book on the subject, drawn from polar explorers, shipwreck survivors, mountaineers, prisoners of war, and 9/11 survivors who escaped the World Trade Center. The neurological and psychological explanations vary. Some researchers attribute the experience to a kind of bicameral splitting under extreme stress, in which the brain, recognizing that the conscious self is failing, generates a second self that can offer encouragement and direction. Others point to oxygen deprivation, electrolyte imbalance, or the simple fact that the human mind, faced with the prospect of dying alone, will produce companionship rather than accept it. None of these explanations require anything supernatural. All of them have meaningful empirical support. This is the most intellectually honest skeptical counter to what David told me. A man in shock, hypothermic, suffering from significant blood loss, lying alone on a scree slope and watching the sun go down on what he believed would be his last day. That man's brain is precisely the kind of brain that, in the documented literature, produces a phantom rescuer. I take this seriously. I want you to know that I take this seriously. I am not going to dismiss the third man factor in this video because the channel does not work that way and because the phenomenon is real. But here is what the third man factor does not explain. The third man factor explains the sensation of a presence. It explains the felt experience of being accompanied. It does not explain, and to my knowledge has never been argued to explain, a survivor moving 13 miles across high mountain terrain that they could not have crossed under their own power. The presence is psychological. The geography is physical. A man on broken legs does not relocate himself 11 miles in a straight line across a 6,000-foot ridge by means of a comforting hallucination. I personally think this is the cleanest test case I have ever encountered for separating what the mind invents in crisis from what actually happened to a body in the physical world. Because the mind can invent a rescuer. Absolutely it can. The mind cannot move a body.
If you have made it this far into the story, and I know it is a strange one, do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. I research, I stillman the skeptics, I bring you accounts I find and actually believe worth your time, and adjust them into a comprehensive narrative. And drop me a comment if you have ever been in real trouble in the woods, the kind where you weren't sure you were going to come back. I want to hear it.
David spent 6 weeks in 2 casts and another 4 months in physical therapy. The medical recovery was complete. He walks normally now, with a very slight favoring of the right leg in cold weather that you would not notice unless he told you. He went back to work full-time the following spring. He has not been backpacking alone in the North Cascades or anywhere else since the day of the fall. He told his wife the full account on the 3rd day of his hospital stay. After the 2nd round of imaging confirmed he was going to keep both legs. He had not planned to tell her. He told me he had planned to take the story to his grave because he could not see what telling it would accomplish and could see clearly what telling it would cost. But she sat down next to his bed that afternoon and asked him very directly what had happened to him in the 4 hours that nobody could account for. And he found he could not lie to her about it. She believed him. She has continued to believe him. She is the only person in his life, besides me, who knows the account in full. When I asked him in our second conversation why he had decided to tell me to talk to anyone ever, he was quiet for a long time before he answered. And what he said was that he did not feel he owed the story to the world. He did not feel he owed it to a community of researchers, or to a tradition of forest beings, or to any abstract notion of disclosure. He felt he owed it to the creature. That was the word he used. Owed. Whatever it was that came down that slope and carried him out of that drainage had done something for him that it did not have to do. And the only way he had of acknowledging that, in a life in which he could not name it, or photograph it, or speak publicly about it, was to make sure that one careful account of what it had done was preserved somewhere outside his own head. David's account is not unique. I want to close on this because I think it is the most important thing about this story, and the part that gets the least attention in the public-facing Bigfoot conversation. There is a quiet thread in the cryptid literature, going back as far as the literature goes, of Sasquatch rescue accounts. Hikers helped down from places they could not have descended on their own. Hunters guided back to camps they had lost in the dark. Children, in a small number of carefully documented cases, returned to families after being lost in the woods for periods during which their survival should not have been possible. These stories are less famous than the encounter accounts that involve menace, because they are less marketable, and because they complicate the apex monster framing that the field has spent 100 years building. Indigenous traditions across Western North America have carried this thread for far longer than the modern record has been keeping it. The Sauksuiatl, the Lumi, the Karuk, the Yurok. Across multiple unrelated language families and unrelated cultures, the forest being is described with surprising consistency as a presence that can be helpful as well as fearsome, territorial, watchful, and on occasion intervening on the side of human beings who have ended up in genuine trouble. I made a video earlier in this channel's history about the Albert Ostman captivity account, where a man reported being taken by a family of Sasquatch in British Columbia in the 1920s and held for several days. The thing that has always stood out about that case is that the creatures in it never hurt him. They fed him. They kept him in their group. They eventually let him go. The behavioral pattern Ostman described in 1957 is not the inverse of the pattern in David's account. It is the same pattern in a different key. I think this is a video I'm going to come back to at some point on a longer timeline, because the question of what we are actually seeing across these consistent behavioral reports, across cultures, across centuries, across witnesses who have nothing in common except that they were unlucky or lucky enough to have the experience, is a question that the field deserves a more serious conversation about than it has had so far. I'm working on it. I'll get there.
I cannot prove what carried David. He cannot either. But I can tell you that everything checkable in his story checks out. That everything unverifiable in his story is consistent with a small handful of similar accounts I have read. Make of that what you will. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.